They said the Orphan was useless. The Comanche chief gave her the tribe's name. The noon wind carried dust through the trading post yard, stinging eyes and pride in equal measure, and the men on the porch laughed the kind of laughter that comes cheap when it costs someone else's dignity. The girl stood barefoot in the dirt, small and hollow-eyed, her dress too thin for the sun and too old for her years. "Ain't worth feedin'," one of them said, spitting tobacco near her feet. "Can't milk, can't mend, can't even speak proper." Another man shook his head, smirking. "Best send her south. The Comanche'll make better use of her." The words rippled through the air like flies over a wound, and the girl didn't move, didn't cry, didn't blink. She just stared at the ground as if names were something other people got to keep. The trader's wife stood by the doorway, arms crossed, eyes hard with the same tired cruelty that comes from never being shown mercy long enough to learn it. "She's been here a week," the woman said. "No kin, no letter, no God to claim her. What's to be done?" A voice from the corral answered, deep and unhurried. "Done? You mean who decides what she's worth?" The laughter died as a tall figure stepped into view, sunlight striking bronze skin marked by years of wind and war. His braids hung thick with dust and honor, and the eagle feather behind his left ear caught the light like a blade that had no master. The trader stiffened. "You here to trade, chief?" The man nodded once. "Always trade, just not what you sell." He walked closer, eyes never leaving the girl. She looked up, finally. And in that moment the noise of the place went still. Boots stopped scraping, breath stopped mocking. The chief knelt in front of her, speaking in a tone that felt more like a memory than a question. "You have no name?" She shook her head. "Then they lied," he said softly. "Every child born under this sky already has one. The wind just waits for someone to speak it." He rose and turned to the crowd. "You call her useless. I call her still breathing." No one answered. Shame settled heavier than dust. He placed his hand gently on the girl's shoulder, and the look he gave her wasn't pity. It was recognition. "You come," he said, and though she didn't understand his words, she understood their truth. The trader started to protest, but the chief reached into his pouch and laid a small beaded token on the step. "That's all your measure's worth." Then he led her away, her bare feet leaving the only mark that mattered, 2 prints side by side with his, headed toward the open plains where names meant life. The crowd watched them fade into the heat shimmer, and for the first time that summer, the wind changed direction, carrying no laughter, only the quiet sound of a new name waiting to be spoken. They walked until the post was no more than a scar on the horizon, the laughter left behind like a sickness cured by distance. The Comanche chief, whose name the townsfolk had never learned to pronounce right, moved with the patience of stone and weather, his shadow long beside hers on the trail. The girl said nothing, her bare feet raising small ghosts of dust, and though her throat ached from thirst, she didn't complain. Silence was the only language the world had let her keep. The chief carried a water skin and a bundle slung across his shoulder, meat, flint, and a small drum wrapped in hide. When they reached the ridge where the land opened wide into the prairie, he stopped and handed her the skin. "Drink," he said. She obeyed, coughing once as the cool water met her tongue. "How far?" she asked finally. "Far enough for the wind to know your name," he said. And she frowned, not understanding but trusting him more than she trusted the men who measured worth by noise and coins. They followed a dry creek bed, lined with mesquite, and the afternoon light turned the world copper and kind. Once she stumbled on a loose stone, and he caught her elbow, steadying her. "You walk strong," he said quietly, "like you already belonged somewhere." "Do I?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "You will." As they moved on, the land began to change. Grass taller, wind gentler, the sky stretching so wide she felt small enough to disappear, but safe enough not to. Toward evening, they came upon a circle of burned grass and bones, an old camp left behind long before the season turned. The chief knelt beside a blackened stone, tracing the soot with his fingers. "Fire remembers," he said. "It tells us who stayed kind when the world forgot." He gathered a handful of ash, sprinkled it into the wind, and for the first time she saw his eyes soften. "My people wait beyond the river. We'll cross at dawn. She hesitated. And they'll let me stay? He looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. They'll let you live your name once they hear it. But I don't have one. You will, he said again, looking toward the fading sun. The wind's been holding it a long time. She sat beside him as twilight fell, the stars beginning to wake in the purple sky. The chief unwrapped his small drum, tapping it once, twice, a heartbeat slow and steady. That sound, he said, means we're already home. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm, and though she didn't understand the words he began to chant, she felt them settle deep inside her, like water finding its source, like a name beginning to remember itself. By dawn, the air was cool enough to taste of metal and promise, and mist rolled low along the valley where the river cut through the plains like a silver scar that refused to heal. The chief walked ahead, leading the horse that carried their small bundle, and the girl followed, her feet numb but steady, her blanket trailing through the dew. Birds stirred in the cottonwoods, their calls soft and certain, and every sound made the world feel less cruel than it had yesterday. When they reached the water's edge, she stopped, staring at her own reflection, the dirt on her face, the raw skin around her ankles, the hollow look in her eyes that made her seem older than she should have been. That her? She asked quietly. Not anymore, he said. He knelt by the bank, scooping water into his hands, letting it fall slow. This river remembers every name it's ever washed away. If you listen, you'll hear yours come back. She crouched beside him, frowning. You talk like the water's alive. It is, he said. Everything worth trusting still is. He filled a small wooden bowl from his pouch and placed it before her. Drink, then speak what you carry. She hesitated, then took a sip, the cold cutting through the ache in her chest. I don't carry anything, she said. I think I lost it all. He shook his head. No one loses what they were born to be. Sometimes it hides till mercy finds it again. He reached into the water, drew out a smooth stone marked by a pale stripe, and held it up. See this line? Wind and time cut it, but it didn't break. That's how names are made, by what doesn't break. He handed it to her. Keep it till the drums speak for you. She turned it over in her hands, the stripe catching the sunrise like a thin thread of light. Will they accept me? She asked. They'll see what I saw, he said, rising. A child with nothing left to sell and everything left to give. The sun lifted higher, turning the mist gold, and he started across the river, boots splashing through shallow current. She followed, holding the stone tight, the water rising to her knees, then her waist, until it felt like the river itself was learning her shape. On the far bank, she stumbled once, and he caught her, steadying her with a single word in Comanche, a word she didn't yet understand but knew she would remember forever. Taya, he said softly. It means the one who stays. She looked up, surprised. Is that my name? He smiled faintly. The kind of smile that forgives the whole world at once. It was the river's before it was yours. The wind rose then, lifting her hair, carrying the sound of her name out across the plain as if the land had been waiting to repeat it. And for the first time in her life, she believed it belonged to her. By the time they reached the Comanche encampment, the sun had stretched long shadows across the valley, and smoke from cooking fires curled into the calm evening air like prayers that didn't need words. The girl, Taya now, though the name still felt fragile in her chest, walked close behind the chief as he led her through a circle of hide tents ringed by horses and silence. Children paused in their play to stare. Women looked up from grinding meal. Old men nodded slowly, reading in his face the kind of truth that doesn't need explaining. One elder stepped forward, hair white as frost, eyes sharp as a hawk's. You bring her? He asked in their language. I bring what the wind gave back, the chief replied. The elder studied the girl a long moment, then looked past her as if measuring her against the horizon. The townsfolk will say she's theirs. The townsfolk sell what they can't understand, the chief said. She's not for sale. The elder grunted, but said nothing more, turning away toward the fire where a pot simmered, the smell of corn and smoke twisting in the air. The chief gestured for Taya to sit near the outer circle, close enough to feel warmth, but far enough not to intrude. Here, he said, handing her a wooden bowl. Eat. She tasted the stew cautiously, surprised by its sweetness. Around her people spoke in low tones, laughter rising like embers but never cruel. A woman with kind eyes and turquoise beads around her neck came to sit beside her, touching her arm gently. "You are the one he named?" she asked in halting English. Taya nodded. "He called me Taya," the woman smiled. "It means the one who stays. A good name for someone who walks so far." "I don't know what to do here," Taya whispered. "Stay," the woman said simply. "The rest will come." The night grew deep and easy. Drums began low near the central fire, a slow heartbeat echoing through the ground. The chief joined the circle, his face lit in red glow, his shadow tall against the tent walls. When his eyes found hers across the flames, he nodded once, as if reminding her that names aren't owned, they're shared. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythm seep through her skin, feeling it thrum in her hands, her ribs, her throat. For the first time, she wasn't listening for laughter or judgment or orders, just for the pulse that matched her own. Somewhere in the rhythm she heard the old language shaping her name again. Taya, Taya, carried between drum beats like a secret meant to heal. And when she opened her eyes, the chief was still watching, expression calm, as though he'd known from the beginning that belonging didn't need permission. It only needed to be spoken aloud. The next morning dawned clear and blue, the kind of light that makes even scars look holy. The camp was already alive when Taya stepped outside her tent, children chasing a dog through the dust, women singing while grinding corn, men tightening bridles for the day's ride. She stood for a while, just watching, her fingers brushing the smooth stone the chief had given her by the river. It was warm now, alive with the heat of her palm. The chief approached from the corral, a horse trailing behind him, chestnut and calm-eyed. "For you," he said. She blinked. "I've never ridden." He smiled slightly. Neither did the wind, until it learned. He lifted her easily onto the saddle, steadying her hands on the reins. "The horse listens better than people. If you're kind, it follows." She tried to breathe like he did, slow, certain. And when the animal moved, she didn't fall. The camp paused to watch, not out of mockery but quiet pride, the kind that honors courage no one demanded. When she circled back, the chief nodded. "Good. The horse knows your name now, too." Her heart beat faster. "Will they always stare at me like I don't belong?" He looked around at the tents, at faces curious but not cold. "They stare because they're learning. Belonging is a story told twice, once by you, once by them. Give it time." She nodded, and as she dismounted, she noticed the women at the fire beckoning her over. One held out a piece of bread. "Eat, Taya," she said, her accent thick but her smile soft. The name sounded right in their mouths, different but real. As she sat with them, helping stir the pot and braid the dried herbs, the chief spoke with the elders under the shade of a cedar tree. The oldest woman lifted her hands toward the sun, her bracelets flashing. "The girl carries no blood of ours," she said, "but her spirit walked this land before. The fire's already chosen her." "Then let it speak," the chief replied. That evening, they built the fire higher, the entire camp gathering around as twilight bled into indigo. The air smelled of sage and smoke, the drums slow and steady. The elder woman threw a handful of crushed herbs into the flame, which hissed and turned gold, then green. She pointed to Taya. "Step forward." The world seemed to still. The wind, the murmurs, even her heartbeat. Taya obeyed. The chief stood behind her, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. "You were called useless," he said in a voice that carried through the night, "but the fire calls you something else." The elder nodded, chanting a word that rolled like thunder through prayer. "Taya, Koma," she turned to the girl. "It means child of the flame. The tribe's name now burns with yours." A cheer rose, not loud but strong and warm, and Taya felt the world tilt into its rightful place. The fire flickered once, twice, then steadied, as if it too had decided to stay. Days passed like wind over tall grass, and the camp moved with the rhythm of survival. Morning smoke, afternoon laughter, evening songs that carried farther than any border. Taya worked beside the women now, learning the patterns of their language the way a river learns its bends, slow, sure, inevitable. She fetched water, brushed horses, and listened more than she spoke. The chief watched her from a quiet distance, approving without praise, guiding without command. "You're learning," he said one dusk as she returned from the river with the last of the buckets. "The water knows you now," she smiled faintly. "It still bites my feet," he chuckled. "It does that to all who forget where they came from." They sat by the edge of camp, where the plains stretched endless and forgiving. Herds moved like dark clouds in the distance, and the air smelled of rain still days away. "Do they really think I belong?" she asked. "They don't think it," he said. "They see it. There's a difference." She traced the mark in the dirt with a stick. "And you? Why did you save me?" He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the firelight from the camp. "Because I saw the wind stop for you," he said. "That's how the land tells a man he's found something that shouldn't be lost." Before she could answer, the sound of a drum rose from the fire circle, a low, steady pulse that called every heart to listen. The chief stood and motioned for her to follow. Around the fire, the tribe gathered as the singers began a chant older than any treaty, older than the fences men built to claim what was never theirs. The beat matched the rise and fall of breath, and the old woman, the same who had named her, handed Taya a small rattle made of bone and seeds. "You shake it when you remember who you are," she said. Taya nodded, joining the rhythm. The song built slow, like a storm gathering in the distance, and when her voice joined, uncertain at first, then stronger, the chief looked across the flames and smiled. The tribe's chant shifted subtly, one syllable changing, so that her name fit inside it like a heartbeat inside a chest. "Taya Koma," they sang, again and again, until the words and the wind were one sound. When the song faded, only the fire spoke, crackling softly. She sat back, dizzy with something she couldn't name. Peace, maybe, or forgiveness finally finding a body to live in. The chief broke the silence. "Now the plain knows your song. Tomorrow we ride east. There's land that still forgets how to listen." She looked up at him, the flame reflecting in her eyes. "Then we'll teach it," she said. He nodded once, proud and quiet, and the night folded around them, full of stars and the hum of belonging. The morning they left camp, the plains were the color of copper and forgiveness. The tribe gathered to see them off, children laughing, elders silent, the chief's horse pawing at the earth as if it knew the trail ahead would be written in dust and prayer. Taya adjusted the saddle blanket beneath her mare, hands still awkward but sure, her heart pulling in two directions at once, toward the land that had healed her and the unknown horizon waiting to test that healing. "Why east?" she asked, her voice almost lost in the wind. The chief fastened a bundle behind his saddle. "There's a settlement near the Red Canyon. The soldiers there burn what they don't understand. Mercy needs to ride ahead of them for once." She nodded, even though the weight of those words pressed like stones against her ribs. They rode through tall grass that whispered like ghosts, remembering better days. And every so often, he pointed out things she would have missed. The hawk's shadow tracing circles over prey, the bent cedar that marked an old trail, the way the wind always carried the scent of rain before the clouds appeared. "The land teaches slower than men listen," he said, "but it teaches true." Near midday, they stopped by a stream, the water cold and fast. Taya knelt to drink, catching a reflection in the surface. The girl who had once been nameless, sold, and silent was gone. The one looking back carried the tribe's paint faint on her cheek and the steadiness of belonging in her eyes. "You look like them now," she said, almost shy. The chief smiled. "You look like yourself." They rode again as thunder muttered far off. When they reached the ridge, a wisp of smoke rose from the east, thin, gray, human. "That's them," he said quietly. "The fort men." Taya's throat tightened. "Will they listen?" He looked at her, his expression as calm as rain before it falls. "If they don't, they'll still see." By nightfall, they camped beneath a stand of juniper, the sky bruised purple with storm. The chief built a small fire and handed her the rattle. "Tomorrow," he said, "we remind them that worth isn't something men give. It's something the Creator never took away." She lay awake long after he slept, listening to the wind hum through the branches, and realized it was carrying her name again, Taya Koma, stronger this time, like the land itself had decided to remember her. They reached the Red Canyon at noon, when the sun painted every wall in blood and gold. Smoke rose from the far side, thin, human, wrong. The chief dismounted first, scanning the horizon, his eyes narrowing at the sight of broken wagons and charred posts scattered like bones. "Fort men," he murmured. "They burned the trade camp." Taya felt the heat of the canyon crawl into her chest. "Why would they do that?" "Because mercy speaks a language they forgot," he said quietly. As they rode closer, the silence grew sharp. A single canvas flag fluttered on a pole beside the ruined tents, the color bleached to gray. Beneath it lay an old Comanche drum, half buried in ash. The chief knelt, touching the rim with reverence. "This drum once carried the tribe's heartbeat," he said. "Now it waits for someone to remember." He handed Taya the rattle. "Shake it once, for every name they tried to erase." She obeyed, her hand trembling as she raised the sound into the hot, still air. Each shake sent a whisper through the canyon, echoing against the red stone like the voices of those who had sung before her. The chief began to hum, low and steady, and before long the wind joined in, gusting through the gorge in time with their rhythm until the smoke seemed to bow to it. From behind a ridge, movement flickered. 3 riders in blue coats, rifles slung low. "Soldiers," the chief said. He didn't reach for his weapon. "They'll come close. Let them see what they've made." The men approached, their horses uneasy, their faces uncertain in the glare. "You're trespassing," one called out, voice brittle against the canyon's calm. The chief turned slowly, the firelight from the scorched earth glinting on his braids. "So are you," he said. "This land breathes. You just forgot how to listen." The soldier frowned. "You here for revenge?" "No," the chief said. "For remembrance." He stepped aside, revealing Taya standing beside the broken drum. The soldiers hesitated, unsure how to aim at something that looked more like faith than threat. She lifted the rattle once more and shook it, slow and steady. The sound carried through the canyon like a heartbeat starting again. One of the soldiers, young, pale, afraid, lowered his rifle first. "Sir," he whispered, "she's just a child." The chief met his gaze. Every war begins when men stop seeing that. No one spoke after that. The wind died, the smoke thinned, and the canyon held its breath as if deciding whether to burn again or heal. When they finally turned back toward camp, the ashes no longer looked dead. They glowed faintly in the sun like the beginning of forgiveness. That night they camped beside the canyon rim, the stars fierce and clean above, the world below still smoldering with its quiet grief. The chief sat by the fire, repairing the torn edge of the old drum, his hands patient, each stitch a prayer. Taya watched in silence, the glow from the coals flickering across her face. "Will it ever sound the same again?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Nothing true ever sounds the same twice, but it will live." When he finished, he set the drum between them, its surface gleaming faintly where the moonlight touched the hide. "Strike it," he said. She hesitated, afraid to break the stillness. "Now," he urged, "let it hear the name it gave you." She raised her hand, palm trembling, and brought it down gently. The sound rolled out low and deep, like the earth remembering something it had buried. Again she struck, harder this time, and the echo climbed the canyon wall, spreading outward until even the coyotes fell silent. The chief nodded. "There, it knows you." Tears filled her eyes. "I didn't think I could make anything live again." "Then you've learned what the fire already knew," he said softly. "Everything that burns bright must teach warmth before it fades." She stared into the flames, thinking of the street where she'd once been sold, of the men who laughed, of the emptiness that had followed. Those faces seemed smaller now, blurred by distance, almost forgiven. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" she whispered. The chief stirred the fire. "Understanding isn't what we wait for. It's what we leave behind." They sat long into the night, the drum between them like a shared heartbeat. The wind carried the faint smell of rain from the south, and thunder murmured somewhere far away. Not a warning this time, just the sky remembering how to breathe. When she finally lay down, the rattle still in her hand, the rhythm of the drum lingered in her chest, steady as truth. In her dream, she saw herself walking across the same street where she'd been sold, but now the earth beneath her feet glowed warm, and the people there were only shadows fading with the dawn. The next morning when she woke, the chief was already saddling the horses. "We ride home," he said. "The land's ready to listen again." And as the sun broke over the red stone, she realized the world didn't look smaller anymore. It looked alive, like something that had chosen her too. When they returned to the valley, spring had already begun to write green into the edges of the earth. The camp stood quiet, but waiting, smoke curling gently from the center fire, the air carrying that clean smell of rain-soaked cedar. Children ran ahead of them, shouting her name, Taya Koma, as if it were a song that belonged to the wind now. The chief dismounted slowly, his eyes soft with pride that he did not need to say. "You've brought the drum home," the elder woman said, her weathered hands trembling as she touched the repaired hide. "And you've brought its voice back too." Taya smiled faintly. "It wasn't mine alone." The old woman looked at her, head tilted. "It never is." That night the tribe gathered once more around the fire, not for naming, not for mourning, but for remembering. The stars leaned low. The drum beat slow and steady, and Taya sat beside the chief, her hand resting on the rattle that had carried her through every silence. When the singing began, it was her voice that rose first, clear, sure, no longer the voice of a child, but of someone who had found where her spirit lived. The firelight touched her cheek like a blessing, and the people echoed her song until it filled the valley. The chief closed his eyes, listening, and for the first time in years he felt no debt to the past, only gratitude to the present. When the song faded, he turned to her and said quietly, "You were called useless once." She nodded, eyes bright. "They didn't know the name fire would give me," he smiled. "They will now." The night breathed deep, carrying her voice across the grasslands where no fence could stop it. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, the red canyon answered with a faint distant drumbeat, steady and alive. Taya looked up, whispering to the stars. "I stayed." The chief placed his hand over his heart. "And so did we." The fire burned low, the embers pulsing like the rhythm of forgiveness, and when the dawn finally came, it found them still there, unbroken, unashamed, and named by the very land that once forgot them. The wind passed softly through the camp, lifting a single feather from the ashes and carrying it east, toward the morning. If this story reminded you that worth isn't given by men, but carried by mercy, then share it so others remember too. Subscribe to Redemption West, where the broken are named again, the forgotten are found, and every story proves that love still builds.